Welcome to tonight's CEO Show. We have a very special guest. He is the CEO of Extron, Sandeep Duggal. Sandeep, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Carl. Good to be here.
Can you give our listeners a quick historical perspective of how tech companies' supply chains have changed in the last 20 years and what has driven this realignment?
Essentially, the 80s and 90s saw mass outsourcing to Asia. Since then, a lot has taken place, right? So there's been broad geopolitical changes. There have been large social, macro, and microeconomic changes. I'm personally an economics buff, so I find this stuff absolutely fascinating. So geopolitically, concern about the power of Asian manufacturing countries, specifically China, but I think it may extend to a couple of other folks. We see that in the news all the time, no surprise. There's increasing desire to bring manufacturing activities back to the U.S., politically again, in the political circles. Increasing concern over large-scale supply disruption being a national security issue. A lot of other things in that front. Macroeconomically and microeconomically, there's significant changes also. Freight costs are going up. Inventory has always been a bad thing in supply chain circles, and it's become even worse as product life cycles have compressed. And so bad if you get caught with a lot of inventory and you get a product change. Intel changes its microprocessor to the latest version, for example. It's a bad position to be in. We do remember the early 2000s when companies wrote off billions of dollars during the brief downturn we had then. And it was because they had too much inventory. So inventory, freight costs, changes in lead times due to security concerns, driven by 9/11 and other events like that. And then consumers just changing trends, and consumers wanted to change their minds. I'm talking about business consumers as well as retail consumers. Changes in exchange rates, wage rates changing in Asia, into IP protection concerns overseas. There are a variety of big picture things that are now beginning to enter the whole supply chain equation.
How do you think companies should respond to those changes?
That's a great question. I think that in general, U.S. companies outsourced blindly in the 80s and 90s, and the outsourcing that took place then was, I think, largely well-founded because people had to respond quickly. But there are some critical aspects of the supply chain that have to stay close to the customer. And that's a real important facet of many companies' business. And when those got outsourced to Asia, well, now you've all of a sudden increased the distance from your factories to your customer, both literally and figuratively. And when you can do those operations close to the customer, you're going to reduce your inventory, you can reduce your freight cost, you can reduce your IP exposure. You can make a whole lot of things that supply chain professionals believe to be good. You can make them happen by doing as close to the customer as possible. So our assertion is that U.S. companies should not look at their supply chain as big monoliths, but look at them in terms of which items have to be kept in Asia for economic reasons, but which items can and should be done domestically for economic reasons, because you want to keep them close to the customer, because they reduce inventory, so on and so forth. In other words, there are certain levers that you can pull. The supply chain is not one lever. It's dozens of levers. Pull the right levers.
What role does the government play in the economics of supply chain?
A particularly big one. And I think that's a hot button area because government's so keen to grow jobs. But the reality is that I think we've operated, our government has not operated in necessarily the wisest or the most proactive way. I love to look at the example of Singapore, granted small city-state, but what a proactive government. How they've ingrained the educational system, linked it to their the industries that they want to become proficient at. The government there is a proponent of business. I mean, ultimately, let's get one thing very clear. The only people that create long-term sustainable jobs that add value over the long term and can generate long-term growth is business. I mean, you don't want necessarily your government to keep growing. I know certainly we feel that way here in California. Business is joined at the hip with government in terms of the desire to create jobs. They don't always operate that way. So I love to quote Singapore's example. I wish that our own state and federal government worked a little bit more like that.
We have a new governor. If
Yes.
there were one or two pieces of advice you would give Jerry Brown if he were in the studio with us tonight about making California more competitive, what would that one or two gems consist of?
Okay. Overall, become business friendly. Remember, business is your friend. Broadly speaking, business and the state government have got very aligned agendas. There's some differences. There always are. And it's a job of business, maybe a government to regulate business. But overall, I think realize that business is your friend. Business will help create jobs. Business is not the enemy here. Now, in order to do that, we have to put some teeth around that. I think there are a couple of steps we've got to go through. Government, both state and federal, have got to get their fiscal house in order. Without getting our fiscal house in order, there will be no resources to do the kinds of things that Singapore did in the 80s and 90s, or for that matter of fact, what MITI did in Japan in the 60s and 70s. Right. So the governor specifically, I think, needs to address the idea. We've allowed the creation, I think, of what I like to call a patrician bureaucracy in the state of California. So the governor needs to address that. I think there's pension reform, there's budget reform, there's a whole lot they can do in that front. So now once you've hopefully freed up some resources, I think sending a strong signal to business that California is indeed, quote unquote, open for business by putting forth a multi-year plan to actually reduce business taxes in the state, I think would be a very strong signal to send to business leaders and entrepreneurs in the state that, hey, we want you here. Part of the problem with business in California is I think the history has been that we're not really considered a business-friendly state. Business is kind of a tolerated, not encouraged, is the impression that I think many folks have had. So then I would really work towards encouraging, the tech sector jobs, manufacturing jobs, pressure the federal government to assure there's symmetric trade rules with countries like China and India and others that really we have one-way trade with. We have one-way free trade with, should I say.
Are you asserting then that after 2 decades of moving manufacturing offshore, companies should reverse course and bring certain manufacturing operations back here to the United States?
Yeah, because the United States, for companies that have markets over here, is the last mile. Mm-hmm. So I think companies should broadly look at their supply chains as having bifurcated in the last 5 to 10 years. There's a front end of the supply chain, and then there's what I call the last mile. Mm-hmm. And it's pretty clear that the front end of the supply chain, large portions of it, are solidly going to be in Asia for a little while. I mean, there's a huge cost advantage over there. But the last mile, on the other hand, I think already has significantly changed economics. And being close to the customer is a really, really big part of controlling your cost. As I mentioned, there's 15 levers in the supply chain, just pulling a number out of the air, but there's a large number of levers. It's not just one. You can't say, okay, outsource or insource and offshore and onshore. But it's what do you want to do? And there are key things like final configuration activities, returns management activities, spares, that are in themselves, you can make decisions where you want to do them. Align your freight model and your transportation model to match with that desire or with that objective and pull the right levers. It also allows, I think, customers to really control their supply chains as opposed to doing what I like to call the lazy thing, which is just issue one PO to somebody and say, take care of it. You actually lose control over your supply chain when you completely outsource it, both mentally and physically.
What other advantages will original equipment manufacturers realize by bringing manufacturing back onshore?
So, ultimately, I think it's a cost reduction play. Right? Now, you can cut costs in many ways. You have to look at your total costs. You do that by pulling the right levers and saying and reducing your costs across the areas where you maybe are experiencing cost growth, cost increases. So, as an example, take an example of a networking company that does all its operations in Asia, and because their customers demand quick delivery, flies in finished goods. Flying in product has got very significant cost consequences as well as green consequences, and we see this all the time. I mean, there's customers we've worked with in the past that have had freight as a percentage of cost of goods sold up in 10% plus range. It's a big number. By realigning your supply chain so you're doing your final configuration at or near your customer domestically, you can maintain that very same rapid turn. Add a very small proportion of labor to your cost, 1% or 2%, but you can drop your freight cost of goods sold in half. So those are some of the levers that I'm talking about. Freight is a really good example. Speed. There's no obvious cost quantifier right there, no obvious one, I say, but your finance people can easily whip up, I think, a number with the right weighted average cost of capital and reduced inventory as a result of this speed and calculate the cost impact of that. Again, not an obvious one, but a very important lever. Inventory reductions. That's another result of moving your supply chains or realigning your supply chains to at least have some aspects domestically. When companies outsource everything to Asia, they increase the length of the supply chains. Length of a supply chain increasing typically results in increases in inventory. And as we know, that's a four-letter word and has been for many years, but it's becoming increasingly so as product life cycles compress.
Sandeep Duggal, what kind of manufacturing do you believe is best suited to the economics of the United States?
Where you add a modest amount of labor. You can quantify these numbers. In general, Extron adds about 1%, but I think it varies by company. But we add a very modest amount of labor, but receive in return double-digit decreases in inventory. So where you have product that's highly configurable, and configuration is a very, very large area. You can configure products by labeling them. You can configure products by packaging them. You can configure products by physically assembling them and doing software configuration. So where you have very configurable products and where you can do that configuration as close to the customer as possible, you're going to be ahead of the game. And we've got models that can put this model each customer's individual circumstances and help them decide exactly where they should consider a last mile solution and where they just plain simply should not. It's pull out an example. Plastic injection molding in the millions of pieces. I mean, it makes no sense. You will do that in Asia. We've got some general estimates for customers. If they've got a product where the value is in excess of $1.50 per cubic inch, that the cost of air freight is going to is going to be too high. They want to do that some level of configuration here domestically. That's an example of a quantitative guideline that we've come up with.